Hello, my name's Rob and welcome to Swift Slots. So about a year ago I made a series of 3 videos. Parts 1 and parts 2 were about me making a chassis so that you can convert 1/43 scale die-cast toy cars into slot cars. And the third part was the first leg of the proxy race that I entered for 1/43 scale converted cars. And between those 3 videos, I've had over 10,000 views, which for my very small channel is quite something. And I'm still getting feedback from those videos even to this day, a year later. So they went down really well. But when I first made this chassis, I made it to simply take a Carrera back axle in its entirety because they're very cheap and they're readily available. So I didn't feel the need to do anything other than make this chassis fit that back axle because it was the right axle for the job. Having sold a few of these chassis now through my website, it's been reported back to me that those axles that this chassis was designed around are not so easy to find anymore. But as you can see, I have a whole range of die-cast cars that still need converting into slot cars. Now these are on my shelf of shame, as we call it, but they will be done eventually over time. So obviously I have a vested interest in keeping this chassis alive and keeping it relevant. So what I've decided to do is take a close look at my Mark 1 chassis and work out where I could improve it to give it a bit more longevity. So what I've done is I've taken some components out on the market that I think that will be around for a very long time, which also give us a much greater range of things that you can use them on, different wheels and so on. Also, I found a replacement complete back axle from Scalextric, which I believe will fit this chassis as well with a small amount of adaptation. Now the adaptation comes in the form of tyres. So obviously with different wheels that I've chosen now, other than the Carrera wheels, with the aluminium wheels and also with the Scalextric axle, I've had to make a full set of tyres. So that's what I've done as well. There's a whole suite of tyres that I've now made that I'm offering for sale as well that will fit the axles that I will show you to go on this new Mark 2 chassis, and also the alloy wheels which also fit this chassis. Now this chassis can take standard components, because that's the thing. I've adjusted this bulkhead here so that instead of just being able to put a Carrera gear in there and nothing else, because I didn't think outside the box other than that Carrera axle, I've now moved this bulkhead over slightly so we can now fit slotted gears in this chassis, which means that opens us up to all sorts of options now, using standard axles, standard bearings, all sorts of gearing and so on and so forth. So this chassis has now become very much more flexible than the original Mark 1. Now the Mark 1 I've taken off the market. I still have the mould, so if you send me a message saying, Rob, I desperately want the Mark 1 chassis, don't know why you would, but I've still got the mould. But the mould has been taken down from the website and replaced with this Mark 2 chassis, because this Mark 2 chassis is identical to the Mark 1 other than the bulkhead being moved over. Other than that, it's identical. So it's still worth having, and the Mark 1 isn't really worth having at this point. So what I've done is I've uploaded this chassis to my website, the Mark 2 version, and I'm also going to be uploading all of these tyres as well so that you can still buy the same combo, but now it's all the upgraded version. I'm still actually offering the Carrera tyres that I made because they're useful and you might want them in the future. You might also still want to buy a Carrera axle for this car because you might like the wheel insert or whatever. So the tyres are staying, but I'm going to introduce new tyres and the new chassis. Also, I'd like to show you some tyres that I've made for a future project. That's rather exciting. Another tyre there for another future project, or 2 in fact, again, very exciting for me at least. I've also made these 2 tyres as well. Now these are actually PU rubber and cast resin, and they're very much for decoration around your track. These are going to be pretty damn expensive because they're solid PU rubber, and there's probably about 50 times more rubber in these tyres here than there are in ordinary car tyres. So the price will reflect that, not 50 times, but the price will reflect that a little bit. And around Crow Valley, you may have seen this cluster of tractor tyres protecting the bottom of the lampposts. Well, these are now made out of PU. So if you have a lamppost on your track that you'd like a stack of tractor tyres to go around, I'm now selling these tyres as well in nice soft squidgy PU. So I'm going to be taking away the hard resin tyre that I've got around the bottom of my lamps on Crow Valley. I'm going to be replacing with these soft squidgy ones, because as you come over the crest of the bridge, a few times I personally have hit that tyre stack protecting that post, and quite frankly the car suffers quite badly when you hit it. So Time for PU tyre replacements, hence the reason why I've made these in PU and I'm offering them for sale. So I'm going to show you these tyres and go in deep dive into this chassis now and show you all the options that this chassis will now take. And I bought a whole range of parts to show you that, and I'll show you the tyres as well. So let's get you on my table and I'll go through in detail all the parts that will now fit on this new Mk2 chassis. Okay, so let's take a close look at the new Mk2 chassis. Now this is actually the Mark 1 chassis, other than I've moved this bulkhead right the way over so it's now flush with the inside of the wheel arch. Other than that, this is really the Mark 1 chassis, and it's denoted as the Mark 2 because it's got Mark 2 written there alongside the Swift slots. So that's all I've done, is taken this bulkhead and moved it over so it's flush with the wheel. The actual motor fitment is exactly the same. It still takes a slim cam motor. So you pop your motor in like that. You take your rear bulkhead here, pop it in between the rails, slide it forwards, and it grips into the back of the motor. And then you can glue or screw or pin or however you want to do that bulkhead there to hold the motor in place. And the front end guide is exactly the same. It's the same guide. It's totally unchanged. And again, that fits between the rails. You can move it all the way forwards. You can move it all the way back. You can cut a hole in the bottom and sink it all the way through. You can do whatever you want with that guide. So that nothing there has changed at all. So we take that out now. So when you first get your chassis, what you'll find is there's two little bars here and here. Now they have to go. They're only there so that when I mould it, I don't get horrible little air bubbles on these parts here where the bearings go. So you can simply snap it out with your fingernails. They come straight out like that, and there you go, you're done. Now when you fit your bearings, you may find you may need to get a file and just gently tickle the inside of those bearing faces, just gently, just so that when you clip a bearing in, they're a nice snug fit but they're not tight. You don't want to be bending this chassis at all. You just want it to clip in place and just be nice and firm. But if you get a pair of pliers on them, you can kind of move them around a little bit. They don't want to be so tight as they're bending the chassis. And the reason I've left them potentially a little bit tight is because all bearings are a little bit different. So making it a little bit tight means you can just fettle the bearings that you have so they fit really, really nicely in the chassis. So moving on to all the axles. Now the original chassis, as I said, was purely designed around the Carrera axle. Now I've nicked the bearings off of this one for a different job, but you basically get a pair of axles, front and rear, in the bag with the brass bearings in most of the forms that you can buy these in. This particular set here, I'll hold it up to the camera there, you can see the numbers, and this one here again in there. Now the one thing to watch when you were buying these axles is that this particular gear here is a standard pitch, and the gear on this particular packet is a very, very fine pitch. It's probably much closer to the Carrera Go pitch. I'm not entirely sure what it is. I've not actually checked, but it is quite a bit finer than the standard pitch. And basically, they were all exactly the same, really, apart from the colour of the rims. So these ones here are silver, these ones here are dark grey. Now, the reason why I used the Formula 1 axle was purely because a Formula 1 car has quite a small wheel, but a very large tyre. Now the small wheel is a very small wheel in 132, but in 143 it's the perfect size for a wheel. And there's an example of my Audi to show you this axle on this car. So that's the perfect size on that one there. And then my Renault, this is the wheel I used for the Renault, and you can see it's perfect. Now I left the tyres on this car a little bit big because that's what I did at the time, but you can see the tyre is exactly the same, the wheel rather is exactly the same as what's in this car. So that was my original logic about using the Carrera axle, because it was a really cheap all-in-one axle set. You've got your front axle, your rear axle, the gear and some nice brass bearings, and it all dropped in beautifully straight into the chassis. Imagine this has got bearings on. Now when this bulkhead was over that way on the original Mark 1, you can see that I've now got a big gap, whereas I didn't have that on the original one, and I never really thought to do anything about it. It seemed quite happy. So if you put the gear in there, you can see that it was a nice fit. There was no problem. There's room for the bearing here, room for the bearing there, and that was it. But obviously my customers have reported back to me saying that they're struggling to get these axles, so we can move on. So I still sell the original tyres for these wheels and tyres. I won't be changing that. So my original PU tyres, they just fitted on as you would expect, like that, and they're a little bit large because you can true them down. So here's an example now on my Audi. I've trued them all the way down with a sanding machine to get them to fit the Audi there. And then on my Renault, I've left them a little bit chunkier, but you can still see they're smaller, basically to fit the arch. And the reason why they were made oversized is purely because it's almost impossible. It is impossible for me to know what car you want to convert into a 43rd scale slot car. So I've left the tyres big and chunky so that you can basically machine them down to fit any arch that you want. So that was the logic behind these axles. Now, as I said, I will be leaving these Carrera tyres on my website in case anybody wants to use these Carrera axles, because they're very nice wheels and they fit the cars beautifully. So it seems a shame to stop making the tyres just because the wheels are now difficult to get hold of. But I've got a stash of these wheels, so I need to use them for myself anyway. So that's the situation with the Carrera axles and the Carrera tyres. Now, moving on to the first options that we have with this chassis. And I believe this particular option would also work with the Mark 1 chassis, but as I say, we're dumping the Mark 1 chassis, we've got the Mark 2, so we'll refocus on what we've got here now. So the first set of axles that I found that work really well, or appear to be, is the Scalextric's Sport axle for that part number right there. And then the rear axle, which is almost exactly the same as the Carrera axle, is that part number there. Now, as you can see, these wheels are quite small as well, and here is the Carrera axle, for example. So if I take off the tyres off both of the front and the rear, you can now see that there's not a huge amount of difference in the Scalextric's wheel to the Carrera wheel. But these ones are a little bit bigger. So if I measure these wheels here, they are 12.2 mil in diameter. And if I take a typical 1/43rd scale die-cast car, and I offer my 12.2 millimeters to the car, you can see that that is almost perfect. So this car here is fairly typical to that big pile of cars you saw at the beginning of this video. So I take this car as my standard. This wheel may be just a hair small, but possibly not. It depends on your opinion. And then this wheel here, might be just a hair big, but it's in the ballpark. But this wheel here has got a little bit of a rim on it, whereas this one here is a lot finer. So this is available. The Carrera ones aren't so much. So if we stick with the Scalextric's wheel, I think we'll be okay. Now the beauty with the Scalextric's set is it's almost exactly the same as the Carrera set. So if we pull the wheel off, that's another thing to note. The wheels come off very, very, very easily on these Scalextric's axles, whereas they don't so much come off easily on the Carrera axle. So we can pull the wheels off there. And then what we'll do is we'll just nip this plastic away, because I want to demonstrate this. So if I nip off that plastic and get rid of that, take off the bearing, and do the same on the other side. Just take off him, and then pull the bearing off, and then take off this cradle, you end up with a very nice axle. So we can put our bearings back on, and we can put the wheels back on, and then we end up with what we had with the Carrera axle. So now what we can do is clip that straight in to the Mark 2 chassis, like that. And there we are. So that is exactly as you want it, and it's a really, really good fit. And then we can fit the motor in there, or what would be, and you'll trim the shaft away, obviously, and you're absolutely on the money. All you need to do now is just trim the axles down, and you can move those wheels in. Now the beauty with the Scalextric's axle is you can do this also. If you don't particularly want those massive, great big front tyres, you can have, if I can just liberate this, there we are, right. So you can actually have one of the front tyres on the rear, and they go on like that. You may need to glue them on, but they're a lot narrower in profile. Now what I would do is I would take my rear wheel and I would just trim off. If I wanted a low profile wheel, I just trim off the amount of wheel on the back, but then that might cause a problem for the rib, so maybe you don't want to do that. But there are other options which I will show you in a minute. Now the other great thing about using this Scalextric's axle is if you take a standard set of bearings, these bearings from Slot It, and we use those, I will show you now. So here's a bog standard set of bearings. We can take off the Scalextric's bearings, which to be fair aren't a bad fit, but we can take the slotted bearings and they are a much better fit. And now we can slide the slotted bearings on there, and just for fun we'll put the wheels back on there just because, and then we can pop that assembly into the chassis and very gently clip the bearings into the chassis. And now you actually have slotted bearings in the chassis with a Scalextric's axle as well, and it all fits absolutely perfectly. Now a little bit of a word of a warning, you may want to just ease the little pinch points that hold these bearings in place. The holes themselves are the right size for the bearings, but those little pinch points there, they may come around the bearing a little bit snug, and it may flex this chassis a little bit too much. So you may want to just ease it away. Again, you'll just have to test when you're actually doing your own chassis. But as you can see, they pop in and out perfectly well. And if I take one bearing on its own and bring it to the end of the shaft, you can see that it goes in nicely. But I say check that before you go, because you may want to just ease these little horns just a hair so that you can allow the bearing to go in. It doesn't flex the chassis too much and break it. So obviously, if we're going to be using Scalextric's wheels, you need tyres to fit these wheels that are suitable for 143. So I've developed these tyres here. Not these top 6 or top 3 in fact. They're for something else I'm going to show you in a minute. It's these bottom 6 or bottom 3 that I want to show you here now. So I've developed this wide tyre here to go on the Scalextric's axle that fits perfectly. So if I put this wide tyre straight on the axle, on the wheel, you'll see that it's a really nice fit onto the tyre and onto the wheel, sorry, and it makes a really nice fitting tyre onto the Scalextric's 132 Formula 1 wheel. So there is the tyre sat on there, and there is what it looks like up against the car. So if I put it up against there like that, you can see that it's a really nice fit and it fills that back arch really nicely. So in terms of diameter, the finished diameter on this car here, now on this tyre here, is basically 17 mil. So in the arch there you can see 17 mil will completely fill that arch. So you would need to put this tyre on a Truer and get that tyre all the way down. And obviously it would have to do on the Audi as well, front and rear. It would be a little bit large for that. And also on this Renault, it would be right on the limit for that as well. So you've definitely got enough meat on this tyre here to suit any eventuality of car, given the diameter of the overall package. So, and also the same for the front. I have this medium tyre here, which would also fit exactly the same. It'll give exactly the same diameter as the rear tyre, fits in exactly the same way, and as you can see, the two together fit really nicely, and they're absolutely the same outside diameter, all ready for you to true down on a Tyre Truer machine and get them to exactly the right size that you want. However, these tyres have got a double use because they will fit another option that I've made into this new set of options, if you like. So that being, I'll get rid of those ones, that being Pendle slot wheels. Now I've tried to find a solution that we can use long term going forward. So I may have got these packets mixed up, but those are the part numbers for the Pendle slot wheels that I have found, and these are what they call 13-inch wheels. Now a 13-inch wheel roughly translates into a wheel of a model at about 11.5 mil. So if I take that away from that and apply it back to our BMW, you can see again just about exactly the right size for that one. And if we go back to the Carrera wheel, you can see that it is basically exactly the same. So what I've found is that these Pendle slot wheels will also take the same tyre as the Scalextric's wheels. So these are the very slim tyres, wheels. These are about 6 mil roughly. So for these, I've developed these really skinny tyres, and they will fit perfectly onto these wheels as well, exactly the same as the rears. So if I just hook him on there nicely, these are 30 Shore PU rubber. So there we are. So that's the tyre on the rim, all looking very nice. And again, if we go to the outside diameter, it is just a little bit smaller because these alloy wheels are a little bit smaller than the Scalextric wheels, and that is 16.6, and if we, sorry, 16.2 basically. And if we offer that up to the car, you can see again, that's pretty much exactly the same size as our BMW. And if I apply the vernier on there, you can see it's pretty much the same. And then on the Audi, again, it's a little bit large, so you could trim it down, and also the Renault. So we're all in the ballpark. So that's the skinny front tyre. Now these are Pendle Slot alloy wheels, and they are what they call 13-inch wheels. So the next tyre, or wheel rather, sorry, that I've got for the alloy option is the other Pendle Slot medium-sized wheel, which is a 13-inch wheel as well. And for that we need a 13-inch tyre. Again, it's the same tyre that fits on the Scalextric's front. So again, we can pop that tyre onto this rim, and it fits in exactly the same way as the Scalextric's tyre. No problems at all. There we go. So we go front and the rear. Again, they're exactly the same size when they're put together. So they'll fit exactly the same as the small wheel. Apart from now, you've got a much wider rear tyre, which pretty much matches what's on this model as a toy as it stands before we've done any work on it. And obviously, if you wanted to cut down on drag on the front tyres, you would use the thin tyres. And there you see you losing about 40% of the width of this toy tyre for something with a lot less resistance, which would be this narrow tyre. Or you could just use a medium tyre to match what's on the toy. It's entirely up to you which way you go, but you now have an option for a complete axle set if you want to go that route with bearings, and you also have an option for some different wheels if you want to go down that option. And obviously, if you have alloy wheels, you can either use the inserts from the toy that you've got and machine out the middle and pop those in your alloy wheel, or you can get some Pendle Slot inserts. Now, there's not too many of these inserts available, and this is that insert there. And with a little bit of filing around the outside edge, you could in fact get that insert to go into the middle of that alloy wheel, and it would look really, really nice. So you obviously need to very, very carefully file away the outside rim. You just go there with a file, and you can go around there by hand until the insert fits nicely into that alloy wheel. But you actually have a really nice option there to fit custom alloy wheels onto your car, and that would work really, really nicely. Now, here's the big advantage with this new Mk2 chassis, and that is having the ability to fit slotted gears into it, which is something that we couldn't do on the Mark 1. And as you can see, the gear fits perfectly into there, and when we put the motor in and line it up, there's plenty of room now for a bearing to go on the other side of that gear on here, which is what we didn't have before. So if we take now a standard slotted bearing, clip it into place, and then the other one on the other side like that, take our axle and make sure that it's free to turn, which it is, and a little bit of a fiddle around there we go, nice and free. We can pop the gear in, we can pop the axle through, and there we go. We've now got plenty of room for a standard axle with standard bearings and a standard 28 tooth, in this case, slotted gear. And the 28 tooth just pops on the other side of the chassis. Let's just measure that just for fun, and I'll tell you exactly how much this one pops at the bottom of the car. There we are, basically 1.4 mil. But because we've now got slotted gears, we can change that gear to a 24 tooth, or yes, 24 tooth this is. So we can pop him in. We can put our standard gear in there, and there you are, plenty of room. And now it's basically flush to the bottom of the chassis, which is a huge advantage. And also when we put our gear in there, you can see that the center of the motor falls right in the middle of that gear, and you've still got all that play to shim it all out and get it exactly where you want it to be. So obviously this shaft is a bit long, so I can't actually put the motor all the way in, but you can see there by lining it up, you can actually see we've got plenty of room there for the gear to move about. So you can shim on this side, you can shim on that side, or you could put a little bit of tube on the end of the shaft. And talking about tube, this is the tube that I'd recommend you get. This is straightforward 2mm stainless steel tube with a 1mm hole in it. And all I've done is I've taken a drill and I've put a 1.5mm drill in the end of my hand drill, and I've just opened out that 1mm hole to 1.5 mil, and now the motor sits in the end of that tube. So then what you would do is you would take yourself a cocktail stick, you push your cocktail stick in there, and then you trim off what you need with a Dremel, and then clean it all up, make it nice and round, and then you end up with a nice little shim on the end of this motor that fits snugly into a standard slotted gear, which then converts your 1.5 mil shaft into a 2 mil shaft, and then that locates in your gear and runs exactly the same as if this had a 2 mil shaft. Alternatively, as I just alluded to just a second ago, you can put some brass shims in here and some brass shims in here and actually gauge it that way as well. So you have two options to get this spacing for the motor perfect. You can either shim it either side of the gear, or you can get yourself some 2 mil stainless steel tube. It's very easy to get on eBay. I'll put a link in this video now of an example of it, and then you can just drill a little 1.5 mil hole in the end of it, and that fits in the motor beautifully, and then you can just chop it off, and then you can use that as a spacer in between the gear and the end of the shaft. That will just hold in place. You don't need to glue it or anything. It'll just stay jammed between the inside of the gullet of the gear and the end of the pinion that you decide to use. And here's another fun little party trick you can do with the Scalextric axle. If you pull off the wheel, take off that bearing, you can actually fit slotted gears onto the standard Scalextric axle. Alternatively, you can take your Scalextric wheel and you can take your standard axle and you can fit it onto the standard axle. It's a slotting plus axle in this particular case, but it can be any axle that fits. So there we are. So it all fits on completely happily. You can integrate and interchange all of these parts as you feel fit, and there's nothing that's actually limiting you anymore for fitting whatever hardware you want to fit. There we are. So there's your Scalextric wheel with a slotting plus axle, slotted gears and a slotted bearings and a slotted gear there, and it all fits within the chassis. You can see there. Alternatively, if you wanted to use the front wheel as a rear wheel, you can do that as well. Just replace the wheel for the, see if I can show you here. Here is the front wheel, so we can pop that on there, slide him on there, and there you go. So now you've got a front wheel for the rear wheel, and you can come right in and get a really narrow chassis. To give you an idea of how narrow that would be, I square that up on the BMW chassis. You can see just how far out you could run that standard wheel, and that will give you a nice gap there, plenty of room there. Alternatively, you could use the nice big fat Formula 1 back wheel, and you've still got a little bit of room there, so you can move that out, and you've still got a little gap, so you could use really nice wide tyres as well. So you've now got loads and loads of options. So with regards to the front of this chassis, nothing has changed at all. As I said to you at the beginning of the video, we've still got the standard plate that drops in there, so that we can use the standard gear or the standard guide, if I could find it, this one here. And again, that just slots in there, and you can do what you like. Now, obviously, if you've been watching this channel for long enough, you'll know that I really like the Slotting Plus standard guides. They are really, really good guides. And as you may have also known, I also do a reaming tool that makes these guides fit really, really nicely. And this reaming tool comes with a piece of tube, so you drill out your hole to 3.5 mil, and then you can 4 mil, sorry. Then you can pop the tube in, and then you can ream it out and get a really nice taper to match your guide. But in this particular case, you wouldn't actually need the tube because you can just run straight from the raw resin. So one last added advantage with being able to use the new standard components with the chassis is you are actually able now to use off-center bearings. So if you can see on that bearing there, the bearing is slightly off-center, and if you turn it around, you can see that there's a dot on the thick part of the bearing, and that just denotes the orientation of your hole. So what you can do now is if you take your axle and position that dot so it's at the top of the bearing housing, if I pop that in there carefully like that, now you can see that the bearing has actually got its dot right at the very top of the axle. So with the dot on the bearing in the uppermost position, it means that your hole is actually lower in the chassis, which means it actually lifts the chassis up off the track, so you can now run a smaller tyre. Conversely, if you fit your bearing so that the dot is actually at the bottom of the chassis, what you're actually doing is lifting your axle within the chassis, which means you actually lower the chassis down so that you can now run a much bigger tyre and not actually have too much ground clearance. So that makes adjustment of this chassis to suit your car really, really flexible, and it's a massive advantage over not being able to do that. These bearings, obviously you can adjust them forwards and backwards, but you don't need to worry about forwards and backwards adjustment when you're actually running an inline gear, because that would just move it forwards and backwards like that, and it doesn't actually have any advantage. But vertical, that's a big advantage. So you can use those. You can now use these types of bearings in the chassis as well, and that's a really, really big advantage. So these particular bearings that I've chosen are made by Slotting Plus. However, lots of manufacturers make these off-center bearings, so you're not limited on what manufacturers you use, other than to say, to remind you that just to possibly ease these little jaws here, so that when you pop the bearings in you don't break the chassis, and possibly you may want to just ease the inside of that hole just a tiny bit, so that when the bearings do fit in, they don't put too much pressure on the chassis and you don't bend the chassis all out of shape and put some stress across the bottom of the chassis. So that's what I would just check when you're fitting bearings. Just go easy and make sure that you don't overstress the chassis, and you'll be good to go. So one last closing thought on the Mk2 chassis is back to these Pendle Slot 13-inch wheels that I was talking about earlier on. Pendle Slot obviously do a really good range of tyres to fit their wheels as well. So if we pop one of their tyres onto one of their wheels, we can see what diameter you actually get with their combination. So you can see how well that fits onto a 43rd scale chassis as well. So that's nicely seated, and we get an outside diameter of this wheel, and that is basically 17 mil as well. And if we relate that to the wheel arch again of the BMW, you can see that is quite nice, and it falls in exactly the same remit as my original one that I've got here, my tyre. So obviously if I mount this one now onto a wheel, we can see what the OD is compared to my ones as well. So you've got the option of using Pendle Slot rubber as well. So there is my tyre on there, and we can now see that it is exactly the same diameter. So you have lots and lots of options. Okay, so what were the other three tyres on my plate for? Well, they're actually for the Metro and the RS200. They are for any classic Scalextric car that has those original tyres found on this Capri, and they are for the Scalextric's Peugeot 205. So on the 205, the problem with that is it's very low profile to the ground, and you've got tread on there. So if you take away the tread to get the tyre to meet 100% with the track, you end up with a very, very low car indeed. So I've made this tyre that fits onto the 205, and it gives you a little bit more outside diameter, so therefore giving you a little bit more ground clearance if you want it. So the tyre itself ends up being approximately 20 mil, as opposed to the standard tyre, which is about 19 mil. So you actually get a full millimetre of extra diameter, and it doesn't have the tread. So you've automatically given yourself half a mil of clearance, and you don't have to true it if you don't want to, because there's no tread on there to actually true. So, and exactly the same for the Metro 6R4. So we take the tyre and whack him on, and then we can see what we got on this tyre as well. Pop the axle back in as it flies out. So there we are, I can pop the tyre on. These are all 30 Shore PU tyres. So there is your tyre, all seated on there nicely. And then the actual finished OD of this tyre again is about 21 mil basically on that one there. And then the tyre on the other side now is, there we are, it is 19.8, basically 20 mil. So you've gained an extra millimetre again on this tyre. Again, you don't have to true off the tyre tread because it's already up to height, and also it gives you plenty of clearance on the track and plenty of clearance from the gear, which is the problem with this car, is that gear is very, very close to the track, and so is the bottom of the chassis, but more so the gear. But with these tyres, it clears the chassis, clears the tyres, clears the gears, clears everything. And you don't have to take away the tread because there's no tread on it to start with. So that's the Metro and also the RS200. Now, the only thing with these tyres is you may need to put them on the Tyre Truer to just clear the arch. That's something you might need to think about. And on any other tyre, any other car that fits these same tyres, it's exactly the same deal. The tyre goes on, and these ones need a bit less work on them because there's plenty of clearance in these old cars. So now there is my tyre there, all clearing the arch really, really nicely, as opposed to the standard tyre there, which is a little bit of a gap on the arch. So you've got a little bit more meat there, so you can profile them down on the Tyre Truer. And as I showed you at the beginning of the video, I'm making this very large monster truck tyre in PU rubber and also in resin, which will be a cheaper alternative. And these might make a very interesting thing to drive around on a rally circuit. That's what it looks like compared to a Metro. So it'll go around it in a donut. Might be a bit more interesting than a hay bale, who knows. But I do them in a soft PU rubber and also this heavy resin as well. So the resin would be better off in a place where it's not going to make contact with the car, because it could damage the car, I guess, as it's pretty solid. Or if you want to use it as something to sort of protect the cars as a crash barrier, something a bit interesting, then you can get them in the PU rubber and that will protect your car really, really nicely. And that's the sort of size comparison it is compared to this Metro. So perfectly feasible on a rally track. And the same with this stack of tractor tyres. These are 32nd scale tractor tyres, all in a stack. This particular one is also resin, but I do them in a soft PU as well. And you could do exactly the same. You could drive around them as an obstacle, or as I use them on Crow Valley, protect my lampposts from cars hitting them. Being in PU rubber, they go really, really nicely, and the cars don't get damaged at all when they bounce off them at all. But in resin, of course, you probably want to use them more as a feature and not so the car will come in contact with them, because the resin is quite hard and it could damage the car. But in PU, they're really, really good. And as a little aside, these are the two tyres that I've produced for 2 or maybe 3 really future projects. Now I'll give you an idea, or I won't give you an idea, I'll let you imagine what this rear tyre is for. It's pretty large compared to this Metro. I think you'll find it is quite a monster. So I put him on the back there, you can see. So I'm not going to tell you what's coming, but that might give you some idea. And then this is just a tyre for a couple of 1/24 scale cars that I've got that I'm converting from foam or sponge into PU rubber, and I needed something a bit chunkier and so on. So that's to come on the video later on. So there we are. That's a whole range of products that I've made that I'm offering for sale on my website. We've got the Mk2 chassis, and I've shown you all the options there. We've got some PU tyres that will fit the Scalextric wheels and also the Pendle Slot alloy wheels as well. So there's some options there. We've got some classic Scalextric tyres to fit some Scalextric cars. We've got our obstacle or feature tyres there. We've got a secret mystery tyre, which I will be offering for sale anyway, but I'll show the video soon. And then I've got this 24th scale rubber tyre, which may be of use to somebody. Now, all of these products are available on my website if you'd like to take a closer look. And also don't forget that I'm also doing my Tyre Truer as well, which would also be very useful for truing in your 1/43 tyres when the time comes. And there we are. That's everything about this new Mk2 chassis and the tyres to go with it. So you can, if you choose to, go and buy some nice 1/43 scale die-cast cars and convert them into slot cars as well. And I highly recommend you do, because it is great fun, and driving these heavy die-cast cars is a very different experience from driving the normal 1/32 scale plastic cars. It really is a very different experience. It's not me trying to sell you another chassis or anything like that. I genuinely think that if you did this conversion yourself, I'm pretty sure most of you would really enjoy the experience of building it and the reward of running it on the track as well, because they are really nice cars to drive, and there's a load of 1/43 scale cars to convert out there just waiting for it, and it does add a new dimension to the hobby. So if you've enjoyed this sort of content, maybe you'll subscribe, and if you could hit the little bell button, that would be awesome. So until the next time, thank you very much.